Hi everybody, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur. I hope that you're doing well. I hope you're having a great week. We are about a week into July, so I thought I'd do my monthly Marginalia wrap-up. So any video on any stories, poems, essays, whole books I read in the previous month that I didn't post any videos about. And then a couple of quick musical recommendations at the end. This month is special. My wife and I have our anniversary in June, so I'll have one of her favorite songs, one of the favorite songs she and I like to dance to at the end. But let's jump in. We read a lot of great short stories in June. I've got like 2 stacks here. But there were a couple where I read every story in the volume. So I'll start with those. Beginning with Aidt by Roxane Gay. This is a more recent book. I believe it was published in 2011. And these stories are very affecting. They showcase the Haitian diaspora and the aspects of Haitian culture that are preserved by the characters and the aspects that the characters find disappearing as assimilation occurs. And then characters who are even like interrogating their own culture and the culture of their parents. There are a couple of stories set in Haiti, but many of them take place, outside of Haiti, and either from characters who have immigrated or characters whose parents immigrated. And there's dialogue in a really cool vernacular that seems very authentic. And I enjoyed it. I enjoyed these stories. I was reading it for Caribathon, and Gay's a writer I'll return to, certainly. I also read all of the stories in the second collection of published stories from Bashevis Singer, the Spinoza of Market Street. And so these were written in the late 1950s, early 1960s. I really enjoy Singer's stories. I don't hear his name mentioned very often, and I'm not sure why, because he captures some really fascinating ideas and a culture that primarily has disappeared now in his stories. Many of his early stories were written in Yiddish and then translated into English. And I believe these stories are among those. Spinoza of Market Street itself, the title story, is probably, in my reading, one of the weaker stories. What I go to Singer for and what I really enjoy in him is the way that he showcases the tiny rural village communities of Jewish people who existed at the end of the Russian Empire, and they were forced by law to live within what was called the Russian Pale, this region, and they had very small communities, rural communities, and seeing the ways that the characters interacted in those communities, the little aspects of culture that are preserved in Singer's stories is fascinating. The other thing that's deeply fascinating in these stories, and something that I think Singer deserves a wider audience from, is that aspect of magical realism that exists in sort of like the old Russian writers and the Eastern European writers, and writers who have characters who firmly believe in the supernatural. Like, there are characters in here who are convinced that the devil is at work in their lives or in their communities, and how they deal with that, how they reconcile that. And the distance Singer takes, where a lot of, he's never quite saying, I don't really think this is happening, or look, this is just the characters, not me. Like, he is, as a writer, is embracing that aspect of the culture and exploring it in a very deep way. So again, I would highly recommend Singer as a writer to anybody who enjoys either Russian writers or is interested in sort of late 19th century, early 20th century Jewish communities in Europe, or in magical realism. I think there's a lot of different avenues into Singer's work, and someone I certainly recommend. The other writer, I haven't read all these stories, but I want to put this at the beginning and do a big highlight on it. And that would be Horacio Quiroga, who's an Uruguayan writer, and his stories are kind of like horror stories. So I read 3 stories from this collection. This is published by the University of Texas Press. It's The Decapitated Chicken and Other Stories. And I read 3 of his stories. It was The Feather Pillow, which was horrifying. Don't read it at night before you go to bed. Oh, just a freaky, creepy story. I read Sunstroke, which was from the point of view of the dogs that live on a small farm or ranch. And that was really curious and interesting. Sometimes you see stories from the point of view of children, but these were from the point of view of the dogs that are on the property there, worried about their owner. And then Drifting, a man is bitten by a snake, and he goes and manages to get into a canoe and is going down the river to hopefully get to a town where he can get medical attention as he feels, the swelling shifting as the snake's venom travels up his body. And I think Drifting was... The story reminded me a lot of a Stephen King story I've read, where a guy is trapped on an island and trying to survive there. And I was curious if King has ever read that story. It had kind of that body horror that King does sometimes in his stories. But these stories are fantastic. I'm continuing to read Quiroga. I'll be reading more of these throughout this month, probably the next month. But I also want to highlight the translator. Margaret Peden is a fantastic translator from Spanish into English, like legitimately fantastic. She did a number of titles for University of Texas Press. She famously translated a number of Carlos Fuentes' works, but not just Fuentes or Quiroga. She also has translated from Mexican playwrights and other writers. So she's a fantastic translator. Spanish is the only, I can speak Spanish at about a first or second grade level and read it at maybe a third or fourth grade level. So it's the only language where I can really like see what a translator is doing. And Margaret Peden is fantastic. Now, I'm wearing my football international shirt with the flags because we've got the Euro Cup going on, we've got the Copa America going on, the Olympics are coming up, and Mark over at Book Time with Elvis organized a great Euro 2020 reading challenge that I was participating in. Go Denmark, Danish Dynamite, eliminated yesterday in the semifinal on a controversial penalty. But that's enough about that. As part of it, you read a book from your, the nation you had chosen, and then if they lost a game, you had to read a book from that country. Well, Denmark lost to Belgium, so that meant Georges Simenon was being brought up. Now, Simenon was Belgian. He spent much of his time living in France. He wrote in French, but the Margaret novels are fantastic. And Margaret and the Flemish shop occurs on the French-Belgian border. And one of the fascinating aspects of Belgian culture is, particularly in a country with a small area and a small population, is the distinct cultures that exist there. And so there's the Flemish culture and the Walloon culture, and those are just two of them. And they're distinct cultures, they use distinct languages. And so I was kind of curious to see how much of that would come out in this book. And it's a Margaret novel, it's a Simenon novel, so it's a great, tightly plotted mystery, not quite a police procedural, but a tightly plotted mystery. But we certainly do get a sense of some Flemish culture, some Belgian traders, the barge shippers there along the river, and I really enjoyed this one. I would recommend any of the Margaret novels, but I would certainly recommend Margaret and the Flemish Shop. That said, Denmark also lost to Finland, which I was not expecting because Finland was the weakest team in the tournament. Well, North Macedonia and Finland were weak teams, but I wasn't expecting that. So I had to go grab Helsinki Noir off the shelf. And I read a couple of stories from it. Both were very effective in different ways. Jenkem by Pekka Hiltunen was basically like a Clockwork Orange type story. Like characters from Clockwork Orange, like a youth gang. It was very scary. Very scary. Kiss of Santa by Leena Lehtolainen was a delight. It was a masterfully plotted story. It was humorous. It was a really fun story to read. I'll be looking for other works by Lehtolainen. And so that was from Helsinki Noir. I did read one story from my Brussels Noir before I went and grabbed Simenon off the shelf, and that was The Killer Wore Slippers by Nadine Monfils. And then I created a little side quest for myself. So there was the Euro Cup going on, but I also randomly assigned a team from the Copa America for my reading pleasure in June. And I got very lucky. I've gotten lucky on another video earlier this past month, but I got lucky when I randomly assigned a number, just from a random number generator. 0 came up, and alphabetically that was Argentina, which meant Julio Cortázar. And I read his short story, A Yellow Flower. Cortázar, I think sometimes he's grouped with magical realist writers, but he feels so much more interested in sort of the consciousness side of magical realism rather than that more, everything feels deeply realistic and authentic, but there's something supernatural and magical going on that we see in Gabriel Garcia Marquez. But this felt a little different because it felt a little closer to like Haruki Murakami's writing, where there's a curiosity around human consciousness, thought, and life from that regard. And so I read A Yellow Flower. It was a very interesting story. The pacing was off, but it was a very interesting story. The way characters were trying to create proofs for like life after death or reincarnation, ideas like that. And you get the sense, and it's something that's great to find in a work. I think it occurs more in stories than in novels because it's a hard effect to sustain. But you get that sense where as a reader, or as a reader of someone who's listening to a story within the story. Like, you know that the listener is sort of on your side in terms of like, is this person really believing everything he or she is saying? Like, what's behind the curtain? It created that effect very, very well and sustained it. I also read Nowhere Man by Miguel Mejides in Havana Noir. And then a pair of Danish short stories, both from very famous Danish writers, Helle and Naja Aidt. And I really enjoyed the story from Naja Aidt, Women in Copenhagen. And I plan to read, I have a selection of her short stories that I'll probably be reading later this year. From Helle, it was A Fine Boy. Then, non-soccer reading. Richard Matheson, always a great one. Richard Matheson, so many, Mike Yvonne did a whole video, but so many of Twilight Zone episodes stem from writers like Richard Matheson. So I read Dress of White Silk, which was creepy and effective, and then I read Haircut. And I don't want to spoil Haircut, and I could tell what was going on as it was occurring, but that's a good story. I highly recommend Haircut. Idogwa Rampo has popped up as a Japanese writer that the Codex Cantina are big fans of, and I'm big fans of the Codex Cantina. So I picked this up, and I included this on my top 9 TBR, sort of this Instagram challenge that was going around of 9 writers you haven't read anything from, and works you'd like to read from them. So Rampo was on mine, and I read one of his stories. It was the very first story, The Daydream. And that was good, but I also read, this book has some of his essays, and he has essays written in like the 1920s, 1930s, including one called The Horrors of Film. The essay on watching a silent film was so much scarier than the story The Daydream. So if you haven't read any of his essays, I would also recommend those. The story The Daydream was solid, but the essay, that showed you what a unique mind you're actually interacting with and reading. Also from the Codex Cantina, I reread A Cat in the Rain from Ernest Hemingway. I enjoy many of Hemingway's stories more than his novels. I think his stories are tighter, more focused, more interesting. I think he stays out of his own way in his stories in a way that he doesn't always succeed in doing in his novels. A Cat in the Rain, that said, is one of the Nick Adams stories, and it's one of the Hemingway works where I think it's a Nick Adams story that you need to have read other Nick Adams stories for it to really make any sense in my own personal reading. So I'll just leave that there. From Ryunosuke Akutagawa, I reread 2 of his short stories, Rashomon and In a Bamboo Grove. Rashomon famously gives the title and the frame setting for the Akira Kurosawa film Rashomon, but the plot of the film is actually the Bamboo Grove story. And I had forgotten just how, as much as the film seems to be experimental and unconventional and dealing with nonlinear, contradictory narratives, how much more the film provides a resolved ending than Akutagawa's story. And then the last story I was in, from Alexander Pushkin, I was actually anticipating Denmark would lose to Russia, so I preemptively read a story from Pushkin, and it is a story about one of his ancestors. Famously, Peter the Great had a young man, a boy I believe at the time, who had been kidnapped and enslaved by the Turkish. He was North African. The boy was, and he had been given to Peter the Great. And Peter the Great freed him, made him a godson. He was later educated at military academies in France. He became sort of part of that aristocratic society in both France and Russia. Married into a noble Russian family, and a couple generations later, we got Pushkin, who's a marvelous poet and a very good story writer. And so I read that story that he wrote about his own ancestor, the Moor of Peter the Great. And I really, it was interesting to read that and to then go look at some of the more historical accounts. But that was fascinating. Now, in terms of some of the other books, Brian at Bookish and I have been reading the USA Trilogy by John Dos Passos. Happy 4th of July on that one. We finished 1919 in June, and so I've also been sort of doing a parallel reading from In Other Countries by John Dos Passos. And in May, I read his essays on traveling through Mexico. These are written mostly in the 1920s, and so in June, I read his essays on traveling through Russia, Russian visa, and seeing sort of that. This is in the years immediately after the death of Lenin, when Stalin has defeated Trotsky, but is consolidating power against sort of the old Bolsheviks. And the purges haven't really started in earnest yet. And so Dos Passos is there traveling through St. Petersburg, Finland initially, and then St. Petersburg, down to Moscow and the Caspian Sea, and Baku, and all sorts of different places there. And it's interesting. It's interesting to get a window into that like sliver of time. In terms of 1919 itself, I will say, and it's just echoing Brian's ideas, the biographical sections, the newsreels, the camera eye are all fantastic throughout that book. The final couple point of view characters that we're introduced to, Daughter and Ben Compton, very interesting. I enjoyed both of those a lot. The main narrator, the main two narrators of the book are Joe Williams and Dick Savage. Great name, by the way. Throughout Voxer, I've repeatedly used the characters' nickname and last name when sending messages to Brian. But Joe Williams is a terrible character to be in the head of. You have streams of consciousness, and then you have sewers of consciousness. Joe Williams is in the sewer of consciousness, and he because he's the first character we're introduced to in 1919, I think he derailed the book for both of us to a certain degree, and it took me all the other pieces to like make the book come together at the end, and I don't know if it achieved that effect for Brian. In preparation for reading Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, I reread Jean-Jacques Rousseau's On the Origin of Inequality. And then a book I haven't finished but that I've been enjoying is The Romanovs by Simon Sebag Montefiore. It's a big, intensive history of 300 years of the Russian monarchy, autocracy really. And there are so many fascinating personalities. The footnotes are really interesting. I always love good footnotes in a nonfiction book. The one thing that's tough is that there are times where the author mixes up dates in a timeline that can be very hard to follow along. And if you've read some Russian history and know what you're getting into and have a pretty good sense of European history and world history and where things fit in, it flows and you're okay. But there are other times where it feels like, wait a second, we're 3 years back from where we were last time. And that could be, I think, confusing, but it is overall a very good and engaging history. I'm continuing to really enjoy the Penguin Book of Modern African Poetry. If Mark does do a little reading challenge for the African Cup of Nations, this could be gold. And then I acquired the new Penguin Book of Scottish Verse, which is great because it's written in the original spellings, and that's fun it's fun to read books and poems specifically, whether it's Middle English or Scottish, where you can get that and get that sense and see how, try to find the phonetic pronunciation. So there have just been a number of poems I've been reading from here, reading out loud to my daughters, and we're really enjoying it. And then I'll close out with selections from the Selected Letters of Ralph Ellison. I am a huge fan of Ellison, both as an essayist and as the novelist who wrote Invisible Man. I love Invisible Man. I think it's an absolute masterpiece. I love talking to people about Invisible Man. But Ralph Ellison was a deeply, deeply, deeply intelligent person, and his letters reveal a great deal of that. I was specifically this past month digging through this volume because I had been reading some confessional poets, and I knew that John Berryman famously would claim he had been sort of a friend and colleague of Ellison's, and Ellison sets the record straight in the way that he can, and in a way that he can be very amusing. Now, for the music, since I read Rogue Mail by Jeffrey Household, it felt appropriate to include Fox in the Snow by Belle and Sebastian, a very lovely pastoral song. Since we did a great vacation to Yosemite, I thought I would include The Great California by Phantom Planet, which was also the theme song for the television show The O.C., for anybody who enjoyed that show. And then from our anniversary, I'll include Swept Me Away by the Avett Brothers, one of my wife's favorite songs, and a song she loves to dance with me to. So let me know if you've read any of these stories. I know it was probably a really long video. Let me know if you've read these stories, these writers, if you have other works you enjoy from them. And I hope July has started off well for everybody.